managerial approach to natural resources, where we bring in processes of setting up an institution, drawing up a constitution, having an officer that is responsible for your finances, quarterly meetings, and so forth, which completely ignore pre-existing traditional systems or local institutions, or just how people themselves would have been organizing themselves in order to come up with rules on access and the use of natural resources. So instead of building on people's pre-existing knowledge and systems, we have tended to override those by bringing in new and often alien institutions. And by so doing, I think we've lost opportunities of building real robust and resilient social structures to allow for conflict mitigation over a long period of time. And we have continued to grapple with issues around financial and organizational mismanagement. David was talking about corruption earlier on. There are several incidences of community funds that have gone missing, or community funds that have just simply been mismanaged. And in the long term, this has threatened the sustainability of CBNRM programs, as well as the security around maintaining the principles of CBNRM in the country. And we've had very limited success with regards to business and enterprise development. And again, this is because we tend to deal with community projects by working solely with the communities and leaving out private sector. So instead of bringing in multiple stakeholders and working with their areas of comparative advantage, because it's a community-based process, we've tended to focus solely on the community institutions. Therefore, the development of real community-private partnerships remains limited. And although we've had the implementation of CBNRM over a long period of time, we also lack a shared vision between the stakeholders. The objectives of CBNRM for people at a community level tend to be very different from the reasons why private sector wants to get involved, or the reasons why government itself is facilitating the processes. In the instance of Botswana, because communities are not involved in the processes of setting quotas or deciding on what wildlife management area goes to which community, the communities tend to be very passive recipients of benefits, and with no direct involvement in the management decisions nor in the monitoring of the resource itself. The indigenous people's land rights issues are still not fully catered for within the program, because, as I mentioned earlier, we've only within the program deal with usufructuary rights, and therefore the policy does not go out of its way to redress the issues of marginalization and dispossession of ethnic minorities in the country. And the usufructuary rights are limited in the sense that they're 15 years, which makes it difficult for investment or for people to realize their investments, as opposed to your 50 to 99-year leases for freehold, for your freehold lease. And in some cases, we've seen that the community hunting areas or the wildlife management areas have caused conflict by failing to cater for overlapping rights between different resource user groups within the community, as well as overlapping rights between neighboring communities. In some cases, we've seen an allocation of one concession being given to a neighboring community instead of a community that resides within that wildlife management area. And then the traditional leaders or the traditional institutional structures are marginalized by CBNRM. And in a case where we begin to have policy debates about the future of CBNRM, you see traditional leaders actually coming out in public and speaking against the continuation of CBNRM. And what we've also learned that investing in local institutions alone is not adequate. and that there's a need to build the political capital of the local communities. There's need to build relationships between the local government structures with your village trust communities or your community-based organizations. There's need to engage on a regular basis with policymakers and decision makers. And once you start bringing in your policymakers and decision makers, issues are then upscaled at a macroeconomic level, where, for instance, in the case of Botswana, the politicians are beginning to ask questions around benefit sharing at a national level, where they're saying diamonds, like David was saying earlier, diamonds are also natural resources. And the way in which the benefits of diamonds are shared or distributed in the country tends to be different with regards to natural resources. Where the benefits for diamonds are felt at a national level, all of us get educated out of government funds that are drawn from the sale of diamonds, whereas the wildlife, the benefits from the wildlife would tend to benefit communities that live within the vicinity of protected areas and wildlife management areas. And once you start going into that debate, it then pits CBNRM against the very principles, the national principles for economic development and social development. And it becomes very difficult to come up with arguments that are pro the continuation of CBNRM. It also brings in the issue of power balances, where communities are coming into direct conflict with government and private sector, who have access to more resources and whose literacy levels are much higher than those of the communities, who have information and facts in a way that is organized different from the communities. And already it puts the communities in a disadvantaged position. And we've also seen that once it comes to policy formulation processes, although it is a highly democratic country or highly democratic state, the space for participation in policy formulation and decision making is not always equal, and it is not always equitable either. And although we can say to the policymakers that diamonds do not eat goats, whereas lion and hyena and predate on people's crops and people's wildlife, it becomes very difficult for us to come up with real convincing arguments that can influence politicians who may not necessarily be depending on the communities living in wildlife management areas as part of their electorate. And we have tried to respond to some of these challenges by setting up a CBNRM National Forum, which brings together the private sector, it brings together government, it brings together local communities in order to debate issues that are topical and come to a common ground on issues around CBNRM. And we try to have meetings every 2 years, conferences every 2 years, and on a quarterly basis we have a National Steering Committee meeting with all the key stakeholders represented in that. We publish the CBNRM status report, carry out a lot of research on the lessons learned in CBNRM, as well as try and write media articles that are targeted at the politicians, sharing the lessons learned and trying to influence political processes. The National Forum itself has had impacts it has had different levels of influence and impacts over the years. For instance, in 2001, CBNRM was in a very unstable situation, in the sense that because of the issues around corruption and financial mismanagement, one of the senior people within government, in this case who happened to be a permanent secretary for the Ministry of Local Government, issued a saving gram which was suggesting to take the benefits of CBNRM from the communities and give them to the local councils. And our reaction was to oppose that and lobby for the benefits to remain with the communities, because one, the local government structures are still inefficient in terms of spending their own budgets, and the investment from the taxes and so forth is usually spent on schools, roads, instead of looking at direct benefits in terms of improving food security at a household level and so forth. And CBNRM was filling that gap. But the influence of the forum itself has limitations. When we were looking at reviewing and working on the final CBNRM policy in 2007, suddenly, even though the National Forum was set up as a multi-stakeholder forum looking at influencing policy formulation processes, the policy formulation process was then taken out of that body and confined to the corridors of government. And we saw a situation where the policy space was shrinking, and the different stakeholders could not have direct influence on what actually went into the policy. And because of that, the CBNRM draft policy as it's, the CBNRM final policy as it stands is very different from the draft policy that had been influencing the implementation of CBNRM over the last 15 years. Some of the very fundamental principles or basic principles of CBNRM have been removed from that. For instance, the power or the right of the communities to make key decisions on the use and of the natural resources has been removed from the community level and given to government structures, or what is referred to as the technical advisory committees. So instead of the local communities being given the right for self-determination and choosing what private sector they're going to go into joint private sector partnerships with, or which company to give a concession area, this decision is now being made by the technical advisory committee. And again, they're very systematic processes that have been put in place within that policy, which again continue to limit the role that communities can have in, one, monitoring the resource itself, and also in making decisions on quota allocations for wildlife resources. And within the CBNRM policy as well, there's a new element where 65% of the returns from wildlife quotas is now going to be retained by government, going into a government environmental fund, and the communities retain 35% of those benefits. So we're seeing a shift from a situation where communities were allowed to keep 100% of the benefits to where they are allowed to keep only 35% of the benefits. From these lessons, what we learn is that conflict mitigation needs to be an ongoing strategy, as the nature of conflict continuously changes. During the early stages of CBNRM, we were looking at redressing issues of access and ownership. And once we had moved beyond that, we then had to look at balancing interests of the government, private sector, and the local communities themselves. We also learned that politicians need to be continuously engaged in order to secure the political will, that the benefits of CBNRM to the national economic development need to be highlighted at all times. So when we communicate the lessons learned, we also need to be able to articulate what the benefits to the country as a whole have been, instead of localizing the benefits of our initiatives. And what we've also learned is that CBNRM needs to we need to have a strong and locally driven movement in order for CBNRM to be sustainable. In the early stages of CBNRM, we had organizations such as the one that I work for, the World Conservation Union, SNV, the USAID funded Natural Resource Management Program, all of which are, strictly speaking, external international organizations facilitating the process. So we needed to spend a bit more resources in making it a homegrown initiative, such that the principles are shared by the government itself, such that the communities themselves are in a position to stand for CBNRM and fight for the continuation of the program. We also learned that the process of building institutional resilience needs to be driven and defined by the communities themselves in order for them to tap into their own social capital, looking at their own norms, values, and what defines the collective. And that when we come in and do institutional development, we're in fact building into local, we're in fact building into onto the traditional systems. We've learned that information on knowledge is power. Although we have been documenting the lessons learned and the experiences, we still need to do it in such a way that the communities themselves can take that information and use it for negotiation with government, or for negotiations with the private sector, or even negotiations with neighboring communities and within the community itself. We've seen that CBNRM needs to build. It needs to build in the issues of multiple use and access, as would have been the case with common property regimes. So we've not invested enough in improving common property regimes as they were unfolding at the local level. Thank you for that.
Terrific. Well, thank you, all three of you, four of you, count the phone, for this. Give folks a chance to stand up and get a break here for a second. But we want to go to the Q&A. As I mentioned, we're on the web with video, so we want to capture your questions with the microphones that my colleagues will bring to you. We obviously have a number of points from the kind of one step back, 5,000 feet anyway, and then some different cases to draw upon. And we certainly have a lot of experience in the room as well, so we look forward to tapping into that. What I think I'd like to do with this round of questions is actually take a couple rather than just kind of one and then answer, because I anticipate that we'll have a number of folks who would have things to say. So why don't we get started over here, if we can. Yep, the microphone's right behind you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Mellon from the Nature Conservancy. We've recently started a conservation program in several of the African countries, so I was interested and very impressed by the presentations, but especially I'm curious about the last one. You referred several times to the benefits being received by the local communities through community-based management, and it wasn't entirely clear, exactly what those benefits were. I mean, sure, it varies from area to area, but I got the impression that food security, in the sense of having direct access to the ability to harvest some of the game animals, was part of that was something that was important to local people. And one of my question would be, is the management of those game resources causing the principal game species to be stable or increasing under this management? In other words, has that been possible to measure? Thank you.
Okay. We take a couple. Yeah, Sandy?
Hi, I'm Sandy Ruxtel with the World Bank. I have a question, a pretty broad question for all three of you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about monitoring and evaluation. How do you assess the impacts that you have described?
Terrific, thanks. If we could just go down to Marcella and then down here to Jim. Sonia, if you could bring the Jim.
You said 2 questions. You want another one?
Oh, yeah, well, no, we'll take 3 or 4. Yeah, we'll take 3 or 4 and then give everybody a chance to respond.
Marcelo Ramirez, and I'm an environmental security consultant, U.S. Army War College. My question is for Professor Bray. At the U.S. Army War College, we've been developing this environmental security program in Latin America. We organize events, seminars, trainings, with members from the armed forces and different government representative, NGOs, private sector. We try and find ways of cooperation on different environmental issues like forest fires, control, how to detect, control, prevent illegal trafficking of wildlife, and the relationship with drug trafficking. And I agree with your position of the importance of partnerships to achieve community-based conservation. But I want to know if, from your experience, if you have worked with members from the armed forces in these partnerships, because this is exactly what our program is about, how the armed forces, so how people can see that the military is just not word, how they can provide the know-how and all the techniques that they have. And we're seeing that the environmental conflicts is cause of national security as well.
Okay, thanks, Marcel. Jim Rocco, last one.
Jim Rocco, International Environmental Consultant here in Washington. I'd like to ask a question and actually make a very brief comment on exploitable mineral resources and how they fit into this discussion. Really, my question was stimulated by Professor Bray's comment, but it's certainly open to anybody. First of all, perhaps this is a little bit self-interested, but I think the Liberia Forest Initiative, which Jeff and others are eminently familiar with, might be a good model for how to deal very systematically on a multilateral and multi-level basis with some of these post-conflict natural resource problems that attempt to integrate community rights and community participation. So my question is, are you aware of any, are the panelists aware of any model mineral concessions or model mineral concession processes that could serve as models for precisely incorporating these community-based approaches? Of course, by concessions I mean legal instruments in the form of a license/contract from the government to private industry that allow mineral exploitation under certain conditions. In Liberia, we're working on coming up with some of these models, but they're still in process. So I wondered if anything comes to mind that might serve as such a model. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 4 different and rich questions. I can let you guys divide and conquer how you'd like to split them up. Who would like to? We had the benefits in local community, the more specificity. Why don't we start with that one, the first, the Botswana one, to clarify.
Yeah, you're right. I talked about the benefits and did not outline them. I actually quickly ran through the slides because of time. But with regards to the benefits, on the conservation side, we actually see that the number of wildlife within protected areas and also on the fringes of protected areas has actually steadily increased. The middle graph on this particular slide actually indicates that. But on the one hand, there's also a limitation in the sense that we, apart from the annual census that is carried out by the Department of Wildlife and National Parks, at the community level, like I mentioned, we don't necessarily have community level or community-based monitoring programs in place that can put on the table hard data and facts on the contribution of CBNRM. But looking at the national statistics and the statistics that come from the department, we do see an increase in different species, especially an increase in predator species. Wildlife that would have been previously killed by communities for having killed livestock and so forth. We've also seen an increase in revenues. So communities that were previously living below the poverty data line and had no economic activities taking place within their locality are gaining very high revenues from the use of CBNRM. And again, this graph shows an increase of revenue gained from 1993 up until 2005. We see an increase in employment at a local level where communities don't have to go to the urban areas any longer to get employment, but can be employed within their own vicinity in the tourism industry, as well as in running other CBNRM activities. There are other intangible benefits as well. We have, I talked about the sense of ownership for land, empowerment that communities are getting out of the use of natural resources. And yeah, I think that adequately covers this question.
Well, I guess jumping first to the question that was specifically for me, and on the armed forces, I mean, the short answer is no. I don't know of any experiences with armed forces and community-based conservation. The Mexican government, quite a few years ago now, did put for some, I don't know why they did this, but had the reforestation program, with at least some significant parts of it were being channeled through the military. I mean, I think, obviously the problem is that, it varies from country to country, so one should not generalize, but in the country, and where there's been any degree of civil conflict, the military is usually not trusted as by communities, so I think it's a difficult challenge. I'll just take a quick response to the monitoring evaluation. I think it depends on, the program, what you're talking about. But measures of changes in forest cover, and as a quick, well, not so quick, it can be technically complicated and somewhat expensive, but as a useful measure of the impact of conservation programs, and in incomes obviously is another one, which can also be difficult to collect, but all that.
Let me address the issue of M&E a little bit. From the perspective of, at least in care, the kinds of issues we're trying to get our minds around, even if we maybe don't have solutions, because I think that that's a crucial question. With regards to these kinds of programs, you're talking about not just technical shifts, but deep social changes. You're talking about changes in relations of power, frankly. And I don't think any of us really are good at that in terms when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. One of our dirty little secrets. But so the kinds of M&E systems that we're trying to build increasingly in different parts of the world, not just around these kinds of programs, but definitely around these kinds of programs, we're trying to face issues of how do you build a long-term monitoring and evaluation and learning system that goes beyond a project, that goes beyond a particular donor's or particular stakeholder's interest. Because if these things are if these changes are going to sustain themselves over time, well, it's going to be over time. And so that's one challenge that we're trying to get our minds around. I think that one of the things we see in the Sagoon project, if it is having some interesting social impacts, it's because it's been around for 6 years right now, and it's been and hopefully it will go on even longer. The second thing is, with regards to a monitoring evaluation system, is we think in these kinds of contexts that it's really important to have multi-stakeholder looks at what constitutes success in these things. When you talk about something that we blithely throw on like equity or equality, there's different interpretations of what that actually means locally, if you will. And we actually think it's important in an M&E system to try to bring together multiple stakeholders to have that exact conversation. And if not to necessarily agree on what the indicator of equality is locally, at least to try to have a public space where those conversations are had. I know that sounds a little perhaps theoretical, but it is something we're really grappling with. And the last thing I'd say that changes, that we're trying to get our minds around, is, and other organizations are too, but it's the difference between a log frame approach and a theory of change approach. And increasingly we're trying to get our minds around, which ties into what I've said before. But we're trying to get our minds around, how do you take a theory of change approach to this? How are you explicit about the various components of social change that you're talking about? How the different levels relate to one another, going back to what David was saying about you can't do it just in a community. But honestly, how do you actually put that logic out there explicitly and be able to have a conversation both with yourself, but with a potential donor, but with the stakeholders themselves about that? And so, again, I wish I could tell you that we've done that and I can give you the manual for it, that is where we're trying to push ourselves when it comes to what needs to change about M&E in these kinds of contexts.
Can I just follow up? I do think Sandy's point about the M&E is a good one that, of course, is always frustrating to all of us who receive money from any donor who wants to know about this, particularly if your business, as is ours, is kind of dialogue facilitation and it's process-based in terms of its end. But I think really one of the things that we're trying to do with this series and really with this program, by bringing these different communities that have very different things they're measuring, whether it's forest cover, whether it's the kind of governance variables or the conflict prevention variables, part of the real challenge is for us to get out of our go-to collections that, if you stay in a single sector, are much easier to envision, and find the ways to capture how the NRM gains can be measured tied to the governance gains, tied to the conflict, and that's quite difficult, but really is a central challenge to what we're about and what we're doing here.
Concession.
Oh yeah, sorry. Any models for Jim?
No, I think it's probably the new frontier of community-based management. I think, the problem is they're usually considered to be so valuable, like diamonds in Botswana. I mean, I think community-based management comes in when there's local resources that aren't valuable to the nation, or not very valuable to the nation. And if you have ones that are very valuable to the nation, it's probably very difficult. But there's probably instances, local mining concessions and things like that, where you could start to push that concept.
In fact, there are community projects in South Africa where they're looking at community-based mining concessions, especially in the platinum industry with the Bakwena platinum projects. But certainly in Botswana, that is something that would not be done. Because, again, it's a resource that the country relies on for more than 30% of its GDP. And in a case like that, the resource would be managed at a national level instead of being decentralized or devolved to a community level.
Well, I think that was also true of forest in Indonesia. Were considered so valuable to the nation that local communities didn't have any participation. But I think there, both forest violence and deforestation has progressed so much that just sort of and corruption involved with it. There's sort of out of desperation they are trying varying forms of community-based management and forest concessions in Indonesia.
Okay, sir.
I'm Von Millard. I was the team leader for democracy and governance in Kathmandu, and so I'm very familiar with Masego and had something to do with its architecture. And going to how do we do that? How do we evaluate this thing? Segun is sort of the son of another program, similar sounding program, that we found to be valuable, and Segun came out of that because we believed that it really was making a difference. So how do we measure that? In a lot of different ways. One was that, we're able to actually measure the volume of material that was sold, because the materials were things like medicinal herbs or these very exotic mushrooms and things like that were a commodity that was sold in the marketplace, and that could be measured, and the amount of money that was received could be measured. But there were other things too, and it was the number of people participating in governance forums, the numbers of people that were participating in the governance of a particular community's activity. And in that respect, the number of women that were becoming empowered and were actually in participating in the governance of these institutions, which when the whole thing started, there weren't any women involved at all. In fact, when the whole thing started, and I think was mentioned, this is a community forestry in Nepal is a huge thing. And lots of different donors, lots of national programs have been involved. There's been a lot of reforestation in Nepal. I mean, it was a place that was really just, the forest was just being wiped out. And now there are great stands of forests all over the country. But it wasn't just our programs with care. There were lots of other programs in lots of other ways. But we found that in these different communities, they were generally monopolized by a headman, a powerful individual. Powerful in that community. He wouldn't be considered powerful in the nearby town. He was just a poor man. But in that community, and he would dominate. He was the head man. He got all the money. Wasn't a fortune when you think about power, but it was a lot compared to the people that were in his community, all right? He got all the money. So this program with CARE wanted to address that and have more equitable sharing of that income. So that could be measured too. And that was the great success of the father of Sagan and Sagan, and I hope the son of Sagan, that will follow on. So there are different things that can be used to measure. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody about, offline about this activity.
That's very helpful. If we could pass it down the row, and while it gets to the lady in blue there, I'm going to mention we got one from the web that I just want to throw out from Deepak Tamang, who is with Search Nepal, but right now at the World Forest Institute, and is particularly interested in how forest user groups can stay neutral during times of conflict and post-conflict, and so to avoid the politicization that can, from this perspective, undercut some of the good work and the goodwill. So the question of politicization of the user groups in conflict, and I presume in many ways being pushed to take sides. So yes, please, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Katie Whitty from the University of Maryland. My question is for any of you. I was wondering if you could talk about the benefits and the challenges posed by industrialization and these new technologies moving in to extract these resources and how that affects community management of these resources.
Okay, great. Was there another hand? Yes, can we go right over here?
Hi, my name is Robin Liska of Georgetown University, and my question is regarding the revenues from these community-based management programs. To what extent do the programs in Nepal and Botswana, to what extent are the revenues from those derived from sale of commodities on markets, and what sort of structures are in place to link the community to maybe a broader market, and then if there are such linkages, is there a certain minimum level of security and peace in the area that's required in order to not cut that supply chain?
Okay.
Thank you.
Terrific. And we'll give Jesse Ribot the final question, if we can bring it, and then give our panelists a chance to respond.
Yeah, I wanted to come back in a sense to the initial question as well, which is bringing government back in. And that is that in most of the countries, at least in Africa where I work, and I know in most of the rest of the developing world, there are new elected local governments emerging. Not in Botswana at a real local level, but there are at a higher district level, I believe. I'm not positive about that. But in terms of there being local government, what are the roles that I've noticed this has not really come up in any of the presentations, and since local elected authorities are supposed to represent local people, and since there are local courts that are part of dispute resolution, what are the productive and positive roles that these new institutions have played, and can they be a basis for institutionalizing some of these so-called community-based efforts?
Thank you, Jesse. Who would like to kick off the response to the 3 or 4 questions we've got? Don't you all jump
Okay,
at
well,
once?
I'll
Yeah,
leap into the breach. New technologies, I mean, the short answer again is no, but I'm working in a community now in Oaxaca that's 5 hours walk from the nearest road that has an internet connection now through a satellite uplink, and I'm just sort of wondering, well, what they do now is they now spend most of their evenings watching YouTube videos, but what impacts that's going to have on natural resource management, I don't know. We'll have to see. But it's a big question. I mean, you've got this whole world of, innovative technology, and you've got this world of, community-based management, which, is for the most part, I think, not pretty separate still.
I'll take a couple of stabs at this, but again, I'll state it again by saying that I can't give you data, so to speak, about the Nepal project, although this gentleman might very well be able to, which is great. The question of markets is actually crucial in the current version of Sagun. We're spending a lot of time out there actually helping users do market analysis and spending a lot of time making sure that women, Dalits, the poorest in these communities are getting economic gains from the harvest, sustainable harvest of forest and park resources. And so that connection is actually, I think, we think is crucial, because in many ways, if the users themselves are not feeling palpable economic gains in their lives, then the very value of the user groups themselves comes into play. So really important. And then I guess the follow-up question on that was, what about when, I'm paraphrasing, but what happens when all hell breaks loose and there's large conflict in these zones? What happens is that a problem with regards to market economy and market activity? And the answer is yeah, of course. And I'm not sure personally whether user groups themselves are strongly going to influence that. When I talk to our staff in Nepal about this very question, which is the question being, tell me the relationship between these user groups and the local forms of improvement in governance and conflict mitigation that you are seeing out there with the macro in Nepal with regards to the macro situation, conflict situation. And the response that I got was, it's not a clear relationship there whatsoever in terms of whether. So what I'm trying to say is I wouldn't put, I guess personally, and based on my experience in Africa also, I wouldn't put too much overemphasis on the value of these groups to be able to solve macro political issues in these countries. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that's a good start. If I could continue a little bit.
Can we give you the microphone though?
It relates also to the politicization question online, actually.
Yeah, and you know, when I was there, I left almost 2 years ago. The conflict was very, very hot, you know, and now it's still very insecure, but it's not hot. And somehow, even during the times when certainly the conflict would disrupt the flow of goods, there were guys that are referred to as wallahs in the South Asian context. And these guys are sort of entrepreneurs, and these guys would come up largely from India, and they would trade. They would buy municipal herbs, or, you know, and they'd be just a little guy, you know, and they'd just get out of there as fast as they could. And one of the nice things about it was there's this long border. I mean, it's pretty easy access from most of Nepal into India. So these guys, these wallahs, which means he has the stuff, he has something. He has a thing, he has medicinal herbs, or he has these mushrooms or whatever, you know, would come up, and it was a very informal system, and it sort of worked. When the roads were open, you'd find these little jeepneys, these little Jeep sort of looking pickup truck things that would carry stuff out. It was very informal, but there was a big demand for the product, and so it would go out one way or the other, and even in rough times. Does that help?
Ken, did you or you want?
Yes, I'll start with the question on the markets and access to markets. And like I said at the beginning of my talk, Botswana is not one of those countries with violent conflict. But in our own context, we found that. When we start looking at the trends and access to markets, we have to start looking at the trade barriers that are within that are instituted within the policies. For instance, we find that because the knowledge that the communities have is not recorded knowledge, or one that is not owned by certain individuals or patented, it exposes them with regards to issues of intellectual property rights, with regards to getting equitable benefit sharing mechanisms at a global level, and you then get communities in direct conflict with large organized businesses or private sector. And one of the limitations that we have as well is when we start looking at community-based approaches, we actually begin to ignore individual entrepreneurs within the community. and we have not put in systems in place to build the capacity of individual entrepreneurs to have access to larger markets that extend beyond their own localities and their own communities. And then on the issue of industrialization and technology, again, we have not explored facilitating access to technology for the local communities. We tend to pursue initiatives that are very small scale, and there's very few instances where we've taken bold steps to bring in technology, but you will find examples of initiatives that are looking at developing cosmetic products or liqueurs using the morula plant, but there's very few examples, and I think this is an area that can be tapped further. With regards to the local elected authorities, again, although you will find examples where politicizing the process runs the risk of removing it or exacerbating conflict, we've in fact found that ignoring the political agenda and ignoring the political process in itself poses a threat for CBNRM. So one of the things that we recognize is that had we been working closely with the electorate, those would be the very people who would be pro-CBNRM when the policy was being debated in Parliament. But because they had been very marginalized from that process, we stood to lose in the debate of whether the country should continue with CBNRM or should mutilate CBNRM as the policy has done.
I just wanted to piggyback on, if it's okay. David, you haven't had a chance to get a word in edgewise here.
Run with it.
On the question of local officials and the relationship of them to groups like the users groups that we're talking about here, or the groups that we're talking about in Botswana. I guess two or three thoughts. First off, I think that without a doubt, this form of interest aggregation, if you will, that these kinds of organizations represent are crucial in places like Africa in order to have a good dialogue and forms of balances with locally elected officials. I think they are crucial. Risking repeating myself, the African experience, not the Nepal experience, but the African experience suggests that these kind of groups are frequently co-opted. There are forms of these are intercalary with the political, the economic, the social, and the culture are not quite so separated, right? And so what I'm trying to say is, I think what's really important for organizations like my own that are trying to either develop or work with these groups is to be really clear with ourselves about which actors do these groups actually align themselves with locally. But more than that, it's actually to understand that I think that the way forward is to part of the way forward in terms of more equitable distribution access now and into the future, Jesse, is forms of elite bargaining, and we're not really good at that. The part of the world that the part of this business that I come from, we kind of tend to romanticize these processes from time to time, and this is real politics, and that's, I think, is really important, that to not romanticize these groups, but to really get at their social routines, their alliances, how that changes over time, and to understand that part of what we're trying to accomplish is elite bargaining. It's not just this naive sort of get the have-nots into a process and everything's good and hunky-dory. So I think that's just really, really crucial.
Well, it sounded like in Botswana that's exactly what you're doing. I mean, that's what you were describing, is processes are really trying to engage with the political process and with politicians. I don't really have much of a response, but to our, if Deepak Tamang is watching out there in Portland, Oregon, we did get your email question. which mostly has to do with the politicization of natural resource management groups. But I'll read a couple of sentences because it's all a very good question. The question is about a page and a half, but it says things like, community groups and general resource groups appear to splinter during general elections, referendums, constituent assembly, or local elections. It becomes very tedious to stitch the groups back again after each political event. Often the political parties pander to the local political interest and reach out for their vote banks, destroying in turn long years of good works put together by the development and environmentalist facilitators. I don't know, but it sounds like if this is such a persistent problem, you see this to some degree in Mexico, but it's probably a very different kind of situation. But it sounds like it needs to be part of the training and education process built in from the beginning, that that local people can reflect on what do they really get from, what benefits do they really get from political participation, which unfortunately in many cases may not be much in terms of direct economic benefits anyway, and compared to what they get from the natural resource management group, and the importance of keeping that group together and trying to keep it non-politicized. You work in the fall.
Yeah. Well, that's we often try to end on a positive note, and that will perhaps a realistic note is what we'll call it. Thanks to the three, in fact 4 of you, for a rich discussion, some excellent questions. I hope you will stay with us for future meetings in this series. We'll have one a month, I think through June, and then related meetings. Jesse Ribeau from WRI is going to have a major work come out later this spring. We'll have a session that will get at many of these same questions, so we urge you to look for those notices. And then again, you can find slides, summary, video of today's session and others like it on the Wilson Center's website, so we hope you will visit us.